The police boats surrounded my floating dock like I was some kind of criminal mastermind. Red and blue lights bounced off the water as officers shouted orders through megaphones. My friends and family stood frozen, drinks still in their hands, watching this peaceful lake party turn into what looked like a drug bust. Karen stood on the shore with her arms crossed, that smug smile plastered across her face. She thought she had finally won. She thought she had found the perfect way to destroy me and run me out of the neighborhood. The lead officer was already walking toward me with handcuffs ready, yelling about illegal water activities and federal violations. But what Karen did not know was that tucked inside my waterproof folder were documents that would turn this entire situation upside down. Documents signed by people whose names would make her face go white with terror. That was the moment I realized Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her life. After 15 years of working double shifts and saving every penny, I finally held the keys to my dream home. The lakefront property stretched out before me like something from a magazine. Crystal clear water lapped gently against the private shoreline. Ancient oak trees provided perfect shade for summer afternoons. The house itself was modest, but everything I had ever wanted. I remember standing on that dock for the first time as the new owner, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and pink. This was it. This was where I would build memories with my family and friends. This was where I would finally live the life I had worked so hard to achieve. The neighborhood seemed perfect too. Well-maintained homes dotted the shoreline, each with their own slice of paradise. Boats bobbed peacefully at private docks. Children played safely in shallow waters while parents watched from lawn chairs. It looked like the kind of place where neighbors helped each other and everyone respected each other's space. That illusion lasted exactly 3 days. On my fourth morning, a woman appeared at my front door carrying a thick binder and wearing a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She introduced herself as Karen Mitchell, the HOA president. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face. Her voice had that fake sweetness that immediately put me on guard. "Welcome to Lakeside Estates," she said, extending the heavy binder toward me. "I brought you our community guidelines, just some simple rules to keep our neighborhood beautiful and property values high." I accepted the binder, surprised by its weight. The thing had to be 3 inches thick. As I flipped through the pages, my heart began to sink. Rules about grass height, mailbox colors, and fence styles filled page after page. But what caught my attention were the water usage regulations. They were incredibly detailed and restrictive. "These seem pretty comprehensive," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. Karen's smile widened. "Oh yes, we take our community standards very seriously here, especially when it comes to water activities. We have had problems in the past with people who think they can do whatever they want just because they live on the lake." The way she said it made my stomach tighten. This was not friendly advice from a helpful neighbor. This was a warning. Over the next week, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I went outside to check my mail, curtains would twitch in nearby windows. When I worked in my yard, I would catch glimpses of neighbors peering over fences. It felt like living in a fishbowl where every move was being judged and recorded. But I was not going to let paranoid neighbors stop me from enjoying my new home. I had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to hide inside like a hermit. I began planning a housewarming party to celebrate this new chapter of my life. Something special on the water where my friends and family could see why I had fallen in love with this place. That decision to plan a lake party would change everything. As I researched what I would need for a floating celebration, I discovered that water activities on navigable lakes fell under federal jurisdiction. This was not just HOA territory. This was something much bigger. I spent hours online learning about permits and regulations. The more I read, the more I realized that Karen's thick rule book might not have the final word on what I could and could not do on federal waters. That knowledge felt like finding a secret weapon I had not known existed. But first, I needed to do this the right way. I needed to get proper permits and follow every rule to the letter, because something told me that Karen would be watching and waiting for me to make even the smallest mistake. I dove into federal water regulations like my life depended on it. Late nights at my kitchen table, surrounded by printouts from government websites, became my new routine. Coffee cups accumulated as I worked through dense legal documents and permit applications. The more I learned, the more fascinated I became with the complex relationship between local HOA authority and federal jurisdiction. The Army Corps of Engineers controlled navigable waterways. That much was clear. But what activities required permits and which ones fell under their jurisdiction was far more complicated than I had expected. I needed to understand exactly where the boundaries lay between what Karen could control and what fell under federal authority. My research led me to the local Army Corps of Engineers office, a beige government building that looked exactly like what you would expect. I sat across from a federal official named Janet Morrison, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the patience to explain complex regulations to a confused homeowner. "So you want to have a floating party," she said, reviewing my preliminary application. "Tell me exactly what you have planned." I explained my vision: a floating dock system that could accommodate about 30 people, small boats for guests who wanted to explore the lake, swimming areas marked with safety buoys, grilling stations and music for a proper celebration. Nothing crazy or dangerous, just a memorable way to christen my new home. Janet nodded thoughtfully as she made notes. "The good news is that most of what you are describing falls well within acceptable recreational use of navigable waters. The federal government actually encourages responsible public enjoyment of these resources." "What about local HOA restrictions?" I asked. Her expression shifted slightly. "HOA regulations cannot supersede federal jurisdiction over navigable waters. If we issue you proper permits for activities on federal waters, local authorities cannot override those permits." Those words sent a chill of excitement through me. Karen's thick rulebook suddenly seemed a lot less intimidating. The permit process took 3 weeks. I submitted detailed plans, safety protocols, and environmental impact assessments. I paid fees and attended a brief safety course. I jumped through every hoop they put in front of me because I wanted everything to be absolutely bulletproof. When the permits finally arrived in the mail, I stared at them in amazement. Official federal documents with multiple signatures and government seals. The signatures belonged to people whose names I recognized from local news coverage: the county commissioner, the regional director, even the signature of someone from the state environmental office. These were not just permits, these were shields. While I waited for the paperwork, I threw myself into party planning with the enthusiasm of someone who finally saw light at the end of a tunnel. I ordered floating dock sections that could be configured into a large platform, professional-grade grills that could handle feeding 30 people, a sound system designed for outdoor use, safety equipment including life vests, first aid supplies, and emergency communication devices. Every purchase was carefully documented. Every piece of equipment met or exceeded safety standards. I was not just planning a party. I was creating an ironclad case for responsible water recreation. Corinne made her presence known throughout this process. She would appear in her yard whenever delivery trucks arrived at my house. She would walk her dog past my property multiple times per day, always glancing toward my dock with disapproval. Her comments became less subtle and more pointed. "I hope you are not planning anything too disruptive," she said one afternoon as I signed for a delivery of party supplies. "This is a quiet, family neighborhood." "Just a small celebration with friends and family," I replied, keeping my voice friendly. "Well, make sure you check the community guidelines. We have very specific rules about noise and water usage." I smiled. I have read every page of the HOA rules. I am also following all applicable federal regulations. The word federal made her pause. I could see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to figure out what I might know that she did not. That moment of uncertainty in her eyes told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. She was planning something, but so was I. The difference was that my plan was completely legal and backed by the full authority of the federal government. Her plan, whatever it was, would have to contend with that reality. 2 weeks before the party, everything was ready. Permits secured, equipment purchased, guests invited. All that remained was to see whether Corinne would try to stop me and how badly she would regret that decision. Party day arrived with perfect blue skies and gentle breezes that made the lake's surface shimmer like diamonds. I was up before dawn, setting up the floating dock system and arranging equipment while the neighborhood still slept. By the time the sun cleared the tree line, my lakefront had been transformed into a floating paradise. The modular dock sections locked together perfectly, creating a stable platform that could easily hold 30 people. Colorful umbrellas provided shade, while professional grills sent the aroma of breakfast sausages across the water. A sound system played upbeat music at a respectful volume. Safety equipment was positioned at strategic locations, and emergency contact information was posted on laminated signs. This was not some college keg party. This was a sophisticated outdoor celebration that any responsible adult would be proud to host. My guests began arriving around 10 in the morning, and their reactions made all the preparation worthwhile. Friends I had not seen in months marveled at the setup. Family members who had doubted my decision to buy a lakefront property suddenly understood the appeal. Coworkers who knew how hard I had worked to afford this place celebrated with genuine joy. "This is incredible," my sister said as she stepped onto the floating dock. "You really did it. You actually got your dream house." Children splashed safely in designated swimming areas, while adults relaxed with cold drinks and good food. Small boats carried adventurous guests on tour of the lake. Laughter echoed across the water as people embraced the freedom of being on the water on a perfect summer day. But I could feel eyes watching us. Neighbors peered from windows and porches as our celebration grew throughout the morning. Some seemed curious and possibly envious. Others appeared disapproving. And Corinne was nowhere to be seen, which somehow felt more ominous than if she had been openly glaring at us. Around noon, with the party in full swing and about 25 people enjoying themselves on and around the water, Corinne finally made her appearance. She marched down to the shoreline wearing a stern expression and carrying a clipboard. Her posture radiated authority and barely contained anger. "Excuse me," she called out across the water in a voice loud enough to cut through conversations and music. "I need to speak with the property owner immediately." Conversations died as people turned to look at this woman who was clearly upset about something. I took a deep breath, knowing this moment had been inevitable, and made my way to the edge of the dock closest to shore. "Hi, Corinne," I said in a calm, friendly voice. "Beautiful day for a party, is it not?" "This is absolutely unacceptable," she snapped, waving her clipboard for emphasis. "You are in clear violation of multiple HOA regulations regarding noise, water usage, and neighborhood disruption. I demand to see permits for this illegal activity." The word illegal hung in the air like an accusation. Some of my guests looked worried, probably wondering if they were about to be in trouble with the law. But I felt completely calm because I had prepared for exactly this moment. "I would be happy to show you my permits," I said, reaching for the waterproof folder I had kept close all morning. I pulled out the federal documents and held them up so she could see the official seals and signatures. "These are federal permits issued by the Army Corps of Engineers for recreational use of navigable waters. Everything we are doing today is fully authorized by federal authority." Corinne's confident expression faltered as she processed what I had just said. She had expected me to scramble and apologize and shut down the party immediately. Instead, I was showing her official government documents that completely undermined her authority. "Federal permits do not override HOA regulations," she said, but her voice lacked the certainty it had carried moments before. "Actually, they do when it comes to activities on navigable waters," I replied. "Federal jurisdiction supersedes local authority in these matters." I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She had not expected this level of preparation. She had assumed I was just another neighbor who would fold under pressure from HOA threats. The realization that I had outmaneuvered her was written all over her face. "This is not over," she said, backing away from the shoreline. "You have no idea what you have started." She stormed off toward her house, and I knew she was going to escalate this situation. But I was ready for whatever she had planned. My guests cheered as she disappeared, and the party resumed with even more energy than before. What none of us realized was that Corinne was not just angry. She was about to make a decision that would destroy her credibility and authority in ways she could never have imagined. The party was hitting its peak around 2 in the afternoon when I first heard the sirens. At first, I thought they were passing by on some unrelated emergency call. But the sound grew louder and closer until it became impossible to ignore. Then I saw the flashing lights reflecting off the water. 3 police boats appeared around the bend of the lake, their emergency lights painting the water in red and blue. Behind them, I could see patrol cars pulling into the neighborhood with sirens wailing. This was not a routine patrol. This was a full response to what someone had reported as a serious emergency. My guests stopped talking and stared as the police boats approached our floating dock. The party atmosphere evaporated instantly, replaced by confusion and growing anxiety. Children moved closer to their parents. Adults set down drinks and looked around nervously. And there was Corinne, standing on the shoreline with her arms crossed and that smug expression back on her face. She had called the police and reported us for illegal activity. She was about to get exactly what she wanted, or so she thought. The lead police boat pulled alongside our floating dock, and a stern-looking officer stepped onto our platform. He was followed by 2 more officers who positioned themselves strategically around the dock. Their presence was intimidating and official, designed to take control of the situation immediately. "I am Officer Rodriguez," the lead officer announced in a voice that carried across the water. "We have received reports of illegal water activities and potential federal violations. I need everyone to remain calm while we sort this out." I could feel 30 pairs of eyes looking at me, waiting to see how I would handle this crisis. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to remain calm and respectful. This was exactly the moment I had prepared for, even if I had hoped it would never come. "Officer, I am the property owner," I said, stepping forward with my hands visible and my voice steady. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding. All of our activities today are fully permitted and legal." "Ma'am, we were told this was an unauthorized gathering on federal waters," Officer Rodriguez replied. "Do you have documentation to support your claim?" This was it, the moment when all my preparation would either save the day or prove insufficient against the weight of official authority. I reached for my waterproof folder and pulled out the federal permits, holding them so the officer could see the government seals and signatures. "These are permits issued by the Army Corps of Engineers for recreational use of these navigable waters," I said. "Everything we are doing today falls within the scope of these federal authorizations." Officer Rodriguez took the documents and began examining them carefully. His expression shifted from stern authority to puzzled confusion as he read through the official permits. These were clearly legitimate federal documents, not something a homeowner could fake or fabricate. "Can you give me a moment to verify these with my supervisor?" he asked. "Of course," I replied. "I have additional documentation if you need it." The officer stepped away and began speaking into his radio. I could hear fragments of the conversation as he described the situation to someone higher up the chain of command. Words like federal permits and Corps of Engineers drifted across the water. Meanwhile, Karen was still standing on the shore, but her confident posture had begun to shift. She could see that the officers were not immediately shutting down the party and arresting everyone. The quick resolution she had expected was not materializing. More neighbors had gathered along the shoreline to watch the drama unfold. Word had spread quickly through the community that something significant was happening at the new resident's house. People stood in clusters, whispering and pointing as they tried to understand what was going on. The radio conversation continued for several minutes, with Officer Rodriguez asking detailed questions about federal water jurisdiction and permit authority. I could tell he was getting answers that surprised him because his body language became less aggressive and more professional. Finally, he returned to where I was standing and handed back my permits. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to wait here while my supervisor comes to review this situation personally. There seems to be some confusion about jurisdiction and authority." "I am happy to cooperate in any way," I said. "My guests and I will remain here until this is resolved." What happened next would change everything. As we waited for the supervisor to arrive, I could see Karen packing on the shoreline. She was making phone calls and gesturing angrily, clearly frustrated that her plan was not working as expected. She had no idea that the supervisor on his way to our lake party was about to recognize signatures on my permits that would turn this entire situation upside down. She had no idea that her attempt to use police authority against me was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. The sirens that had seemed so threatening when they first approached were about to become the soundtrack to Karen's public humiliation and the vindication of every hour I had spent researching and preparing for this exact moment. The police supervisor arrived in an unmarked car about 20 minutes later. Sergeant Williams was an older officer with gray hair and the kind of calm authority that comes from decades of experience. He walked directly to Officer Rodriguez for a brief conversation before approaching me with my permits in his hand. I could see Karen watching from the shore, her posture still confident but with a hint of uncertainty creeping into her expression. She had expected this to be over by now, with my party shut down and possibly arrests made. Instead, official conversations were happening that did not seem to be going her way. "Ma'am, I need to take a closer look at these documents," Sergeant Williams said. His tone was professional but not hostile, which I took as a good sign. He opened the permit folder and began examining each document carefully. As his eyes moved across the signatures and official seals, I watched his expression change from bureaucratic routine to genuine surprise. He looked up at me, then back at the permits, then at me again. "Do you know whose signatures these are?" he asked. "Federal officials with the Army Corps of Engineers and related agencies," I replied. "Why do you ask?" Sergeant Williams held up one of the permits and pointed to a signature at the bottom. This permit was signed by Commissioner Bradley, who happens to be my boss's direct superior in the county government structure. And this signature here belongs to Regional Director Martinez, who oversees federal water policy for this entire area. The weight of what he was saying began to sink in. These were not just random federal bureaucrats. These were people with real authority and influence in local law enforcement chains of command. People whose names carried weight in official circles. "These permits are not just valid," Sergeant Williams continued. "They represent the highest level of federal authorization for water activities in this jurisdiction. Federal law supersedes any local HOA regulations when it comes to navigable waters." I could see Corinne straining to hear our conversation from the shoreline. Her confident posture was beginning to crumble as she realized that something was going very wrong with her plan. The quick police action she had expected was turning into an official validation of my legal right to hold this party. Sergeant Williams walked over to Officer Rodriguez and spoke with him quietly for several minutes. I could not hear their conversation, but I could see Rodriguez nodding and taking notes. Then both officers walked toward the shoreline where Corinne was waiting. "Ma'am, we need to have a conversation with you about filing false reports," Sergeant Williams called out to Corinne. The color drained from her face. "False reports. I reported illegal activity, and look at this disruption they are causing." "The activities here today are fully authorized by valid federal permits," the sergeant replied. "Filing a false police report is a serious offense that wastes emergency resources and can result in criminal charges." My party guests had been watching this drama unfold with fascination. Now they began to understand that the tables had completely turned. The woman who had tried to shut down our celebration was about to face legal consequences for her actions. Corinne looked around desperately, as if searching for support from the neighbors who had gathered to watch. But the crowd that had assembled seemed more interested in seeing how this would play out than in coming to her rescue. "I demand to speak to your supervisor," Corinne said, her voice rising with panic. "I am the supervisor," Sergeant Williams replied calmly. "And right now, I am more interested in understanding why you filed a report claiming federal violations when you clearly had no knowledge of the permit status for these activities." The sergeant turned back to me and raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Ma'am, your permits are completely valid and properly executed. You have every legal right to conduct the activities described in your federal authorizations. No local authority can override these permits." A cheer went up from my guests as the official vindication sank in. People who had been nervous about being in trouble with the law suddenly realized they were witnessing something much more satisfying. They were watching a bully get her comeuppance in the most public way possible. But this was just the beginning. As Sergeant Williams continued his conversation with Corinne about false reports and wasted police resources, I could see other neighbors approaching from around the lake. Word was spreading that something significant was happening, and people were coming to witness what looked like the end of Corinne's reign of HOA terror. The permits in my waterproof folder had done more than authorize a lake party. They had exposed the limits of Corinne's authority and the consequences of using police resources for personal vendettas. What started as her attempt to humiliate me was turning into her own very public defeat. And based on the radio conversations I could hear happening between the officers, this situation was about to get even more interesting. Someone was making calls to verify not just my permits, but also to investigate Corinne's history of police reports and complaints. The truth was emerging, and it was far more damaging to Corinne than she could have possibly imagined. As Sergeant Williams continued his investigation, more police vehicles arrived at the scene, but these were not coming to shut down my party. They were responding to what was becoming a broader inquiry into Corinne's pattern of behavior and misuse of emergency resources. Detective Sarah Chen stepped out of an unmarked sedan and immediately approached Sergeant Williams. I could see them having an intense conversation while reviewing paperwork that had nothing to do with my lake party. Corinne watched nervously from the shoreline as more official attention focused on her rather than on my celebration. "Ma'am," Detective Chen called out to Corinne, "we need to discuss your recent history of police reports and complaints filed against various neighbors in this community." The detective opened a thick folder and began reading from what appeared to be a long list of incidents. "In the past 6 months, you have filed 14 separate complaints and police reports against 7 different neighbors. Reports for noise violations, property disputes, alleged safety hazards, and various other issues." Corinne's face went pale as the scope of the investigation became clear. This was not just about today's false report. This was about a pattern of behavior that had apparently caught the attention of law enforcement. Every single one of these reports has been investigated and found to be either completely unfounded or grossly exaggerated, Detective Chen continued. "You have wasted hundreds of hours of police time and emergency resources on personal disputes and HOA power trips." Other neighbors who had gathered to watch the drama began to murmur among themselves. I could see recognition dawning on their faces as they realized they were witnessing the exposure of something they had all experienced but never been able to address effectively. An elderly man I had never met stepped forward from the crowd. "Officer, she filed a complaint against me last month claiming I was running an illegal business from my garage. All I was doing was restoring an old car as a hobby." A woman with 2 young children nodded in agreement. "She called the police on our family barbecue, claiming we were violating noise ordinances at 3 in the afternoon on a Saturday." More neighbors began sharing their stories, creating a chorus of complaints about Corinne's abuse of authority and harassment of anyone who did not conform to her vision of neighborhood perfection. The gathering crowd was transforming into an impromptu community meeting about years of suppressed frustration. Detective Chen took notes as neighbor after neighbor described incidents of harassment, frivolous complaints, and intimidation tactics. The pattern that emerged painted a picture of someone who had systematically used police resources as a weapon against anyone who challenged her authority. "But that is not even the most serious issue," Detective Chen said, turning back to Corinne with a stern expression. "These federal permits you tried to have me shut down today, they carry signatures from officials who have direct oversight of local law enforcement funding and jurisdiction." The detective held up my permits and pointed to specific signatures. Commissioner Bradley controls the budget allocation for our department. Regional Director Martinez has authority over federal law enforcement cooperation agreements. When you file false reports about federal permit violations, you are not just wasting local resources. You are creating potential conflicts with the federal officials who authorize our operations. Karen's smugness had completely evaporated, replaced by dawning horror as she understood the scope of her miscalculation. She had not just tried to shut down a neighborhood party. She had challenged the authority of people who could make life very difficult for the local law enforcement agencies she had been manipulating. Sergeant Williams stepped forward with what looked like an official citation book. "Ma'am, I am issuing you a citation for filing a false police report, which is a misdemeanor offense in this jurisdiction. You are also going to be receiving a formal warning about the misuse of emergency resources." "This is ridiculous," Karen protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "I was just trying to maintain community standards." "Community standards do not include filing false reports or harassing neighbors who are following all applicable laws," the sergeant replied. "Your behavior has created liability issues for this department and wasted resources that should be used for actual emergencies." Meanwhile, my party guests had been watching this entire drama unfold with amazement. What had started as a simple lake celebration had become a front row seat to the most satisfying example of justice they had ever witnessed. People were taking pictures and videos, documenting the moment when a neighborhood bully finally faced real consequences for her actions. Other neighbors who had been intimidated by Karen for years were now approaching me to ask about federal permits and water rights. They wanted to know how I had done my research and where they could get information about their own rights as lakefront property owners. "I never knew federal permits could override HOA restrictions," one neighbor said. "Karen has been telling us for years that the HOA had absolute authority over everything we did." The impromptu neighborhood gathering was becoming a community education session about property rights, federal jurisdiction, and the limits of HOA authority. Karen's attempt to humiliate me had backfired so completely that she was now watching her neighbors learn how to circumvent her control entirely. As the formal citation was being written and the investigation documented, I realized that this day had become about much more than my right to have a lake party. It had become about standing up to bullies, understanding your rights, and the power of proper preparation when facing corrupt authority. The party was about to resume, but now it had taken on the atmosphere of a neighborhood liberation celebration. As Detective Chen finished documenting Karen's citation for filing false reports, the atmosphere around the lake had completely transformed. What began as a simple housewarming party had evolved into a community celebration of justice and the end of years of neighborhood oppression. Karen stood on the shoreline clutching her citation, her face a mixture of anger and humiliation. The confident HOA president who had marched down to shut down my party was now a deflated figure facing real legal consequences for her abuse of authority. "Ma'am, you should also know that we will be forwarding our investigation findings to the district attorney's office," Sergeant Williams informed her. "Repeated false reporting can escalate to felony charges if a pattern of malicious intent is established." The sergeant then turned to address the crowd of neighbors who had gathered to witness the confrontation. "Let this be a lesson about the proper use of emergency resources. Police reports should be filed for actual violations of law, not for personal disputes or HOA power struggles." With that, the police began packing up their equipment and preparing to leave. But before departing, Sergeant Williams approached me one final time. "Ma'am, I want to apologize for the disruption to your celebration. Your permits are completely valid, and you have every right to enjoy your property within the scope of federal authorizations. I hope the rest of